welcome to Climate Optimists. I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
Thanks as always for tuning in. Today, we're going to be talking about the much debated topic of carbon footprints, its history, its value, and our 2 cents on how we should view it. Before you get into the reason for hope here, I'd just like to complain briefly.
Okay.
You know, when we do these episodes, I spend a lot of time doing research on the internet. And in almost every search about climate change related topics, ExxonMobil ads pop up as the first search result. And they're carefully disguised to make it look like a reputable source. And it happens on both Microsoft and Google. It's just super disheartening to see these tech giants who made big climate pledges and claim to take it seriously just being a megaphone for big oil's propaganda.
It's the almighty dollar, man. They have more purchasing power than climate stewards, I think.
They might. It is frustrating, though, because if the tech giants really were going to walk the talk, they shouldn't be publishing these ads. We know that these fossil fuel companies are disingenuous. You know, BP had their bullshit Beyond Petroleum marketing campaign, which we'll talk about. We know it's just all they're doing is trying to paint themselves in a better light. So we ignore the fact that they're spending all this money to undermine action on, you know, the biggest crisis facing the world. All right, I'll shut up now, but I needed to rant. I needed to get that off my chest.
I'm glad you did. I think obviously it just takes a quick look at the numbers to see what they're doing with their money and where they're still getting all their money from. And, you know, it will dispel the kind of false narrative they're trying to push pretty quickly, what the reality is.
The problem is a lot of people don't have time or,
Sure.
you know, they're scanning through and so they don't. Anyway, I digress. Let's get to some hopeful stuff.
From
Todd.
that, yeah, we should jump right into this reason for hope. So the electric pickup race is on. Race is on, and here comes pride in the backstretch. Heartaches are going to the ends. You remember that song?
I do.
It was made famous by George Jones originally. And then, of course, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think listeners have learned to appreciate your education of us on country music and, you know, its history. And
well, I know it's your thing. And then again, of course, I think made popular in our generation by Sawyer Brown in the 90s. Anyway, back to the EV pickups. I don't know if people know this, but of course they touted on every ad that comes on TV for a pickup these days that they're the best-selling vehicle in the U.S. auto market, which we could probably look at that as maybe being problematic in of itself, but we won't go into that. The top 3 vehicles in 2021 are all pickups, right? And I know you're a huge fan of gigantic pickups.
I think that a pickup truck that gets used as a pickup makes a lot of sense. You see,
Sure,
you know, contractors and farmers and ranchers have trucks that they're using, right? They're working trucks. But I think probably
it's easy to spot them, right?
Yeah,
it's easy to spot the ones that are doing the work.
They're banged up.
Yeah,
they look like they've run into a couple things. And then on the other side, you have all these folks who think they need a pickup truck to like haul a single piece of plywood from Home Depot once a year. and that's where it's a little disheartening, where maybe...
Oh, they're status symbols for the most part. The ones that I see, I remember stepping off a plane, this is years ago, and hopping in a cab with a guy from Australia and just driving out of LAX, you know, he was like, you Americans really like your big cars and pickups, don't you? You know, because we were just surrounded by them, you know? And
right.
You don't think of it. You get used to it. But to an outsider, it looks bananas.
Yeah, I would agree. But I think you're getting into this. It's great to see that there's a push to get EV pickup trucks out there.
Yeah. You know, these big manufacturers are shifting to these electric pickups, which is, again, I keep saying this, I just would have never have guessed that they would have made this switch so quickly. I thought they would fight this thing tooth and nail to the very bitter end, but they've really jumped on board. General Motors, for instance, the Hummer EV is
I bet you
Which
didn't think you were to hear those 2 words paired together anytime soon.
is it kind of a contradiction of itself maybe to have a Hummer EV? I don't know. But I guess if you're gonna get a Hummer, probably get an EV one if you care about the the environment. And it's not cheap, it's 108K. It's not a budget item. And in contrast to that, the Chevy Silverado EV starts out at like 42K. That'll be on sale in 2023. The high level trim version of it sold out in 12 minutes. So they're not having any problem selling these things.
No, I think the demand has been pent up, and so
Yeah,
it's exciting to see.
it really is. And then we have the Ford Lightning. I want like a like a sound effect every time we say Ford Lightning.
We could talk to our big sound team and, make that happen.
You all in the producer's booth over there, can you make that happen? Okay. But the Ford Lightning's going to be starting out at 30K, which I would have never have guessed that it would be that reasonable in cost. They have 200K in reservations that already sold, and they're planning to double production to 150K a year. I know that some of those trucks, like the Ford Lightning, for like contractors, you can power tools and all kinds of stuff from these things. So really cool. And the Rivian is released now. It had about 55,000 pre-orders, so doing well. Tesla's Cybertruck has faced delays. What do you think about Tesla and delays?
I think the 2 words should be hyphenated. No, I mean, I own a Tesla, but yeah,
Right.
you
To be fair, I think Tesla's come out with some of the most exciting electric vehicles, in the last decade or more. But maybe what we've seen here is that these oldie goldies like GM and Ford, there's got to be some benefit of having, mass manufacturing cars for 100 years or whatever the heck it is now,
right.
where it's going to take a new company a while to kind of be able to pump out vehicles like that. So maybe we shouldn't be too critical of Tesla.
Yeah, I don't want to diminish their accomplishments. I mean, whether you like Elon Musk or not, the fact that Tesla entered the market and has done what they've done
Yeah.
has been instrumental for scaring these other manufacturers into action. So kudos for sure, regardless of whether you're a fan of Mr. Musk.
Yeah. And this Cybertruck has over 1 million pre-orders. So
That's crazy.
it is bananas.
It is indeed. So, in our main topic today, carbon footprint, I thought it might make sense to start out and just talk a little bit about the history, which I don't know about you, Todd, but until I did the research for this episode, didn't appreciate the history of the term carbon footprint.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Some studied folks may know, but the fossil fuel company British Petroleum actually took the term carbon footprint. It was coined earlier by some folks in Canada, but they took this term carbon footprint and basically built an entire marketing campaign around it in the early 2000s. I think the tab was about $100 million. They work with
Wow.
this ad agency, and the whole intent behind it was to shift the blame of climate change away from, these big oil companies and onto the individual. The idea was like, it's us individually that have to address the climate crisis, not the fact that these fossil fuel companies are ensuring that they're supplying all of our energy that we rely upon for doing our activities. They even, release their own carbon calculator. And now, I mean, carbon footprints everywhere, right? I mean, it's just part of our lexicon.
Yeah, for sure.
And sadly, this strategy they employed was really just mimicking things that big tobacco's done and the Don't Litter campaign of the 1970s, where you had a group called Keep America Beautiful, which ironically was just a front for industry, and they, posing as an environmental group, started this whole campaign of like don't litter, right? And the whole point of that was,
Yeah, they were the Iron Eyes Cody thing. Do you remember that?
yeah,
Like the crying Native American. And I don't even think that dude was Native American. I don't know if anybody really knows that, but he's like Italian or something. He's like just an actor. But they did that whole ad campaign, right, with the crying Native American and everything.
that was them. Yeah, and hugely successful again. It was all about, hey, the reason that there's all these plastic bottles laying around is you and I. It's not the fact that our beverages are only being, put out in
Sold
plastic
in plastic
bottles.
bottles. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an old playbook. An interesting sort of tidbit, MIT did a study of carbon footprints, not long after BP started this campaign, and they looked at, the carbon footprints of different sections of society within the US,
Mm-hmm.
and they actually looked at the carbon footprint of a homeless person with the idea that that person was living in, shelters and eating in soup kitchens. And this just sort of drives the point home that, the carbon footprint of that person, and this was in 2008, was projected to be 8.5 tons of CO2 per year, which
Huh.
for context is about half of what an average US person, emits in 2020. So,
Right.
I think the point is that homeless person couldn't do anything about that, right? I mean, that
Right.
regardless of what that person did, they had that carbon footprint tied to them because of the fact that the underlying infrastructure that provides our energy is all fossil fuels. So
Right. Now, is MIT like trying to lay the blame of on the homeless or what's going on here?
I,
Way to go, MIT.
right?
Well, no, you're right. It just shows you how much the system you're in affects what your outcomes are going to be, right? Which we will
Exactly.
get into more of that later.
So some of our listeners might be familiar with the climate author Bill McKibben, and he came out and kind of made the case against carbon footprints. His quote, your famous quote was, "Say you have a certain amount of time and money with which to make change.
Mhm.
Call it X, since that's what mathematicians call things. The trick is to increase that X by multiplication, not addition.
Mm,
The trick is to take that 5% of people who really care and make them count for far more than 5%. And the
right.
trick to that is democracy." I think point being, when we each make efforts to cut our carbon footprint, that's addition and it does make a difference,
Right.
but we could be making a lot more of an impact through multiplication, i.e. advocacy.
Right.
So that leads into the obvious question of like, well, how should each of us be thinking about our carbon footprint then? And I thought I'd, inject a little story about my mom and I, because we've had this debate going on about kind of personal action versus advocacy for a long time.
Mhm.
Emphasis that it's a friendly debate, it's amicable.
There's no you're not coming to blows or anything or
No, there's no fistcuffs. Not beating up my mom. But, her stance has always been lead by example. When the first Honda Insight came out in the 90s, I don't know if folks remember that. She was one of the
Yes.
first to buy one. And actually I think you saw that Honda Insight when they had it.
I do remember that car. And before we go into that, when I was talking about you and your mom getting into fisticuffs, I really wasn't worried about her, but I um I do remember that car. It was like a Jetsons car. It looked like it was like a kind of a spaceship.
Yeah, it wasn't designed for looks.
It was cool that they had it though. I mean, that was 20 years ago probably now.
Yeah, longer than that. I think it got on the order of, 60 miles per gallon,
Right, which
which
was amazing at the time.
indeed, I mean, still is.
Yeah.
That was sort of their starting point in terms of trying to make purchases that help reduce their carbon footprint, their climate impact. Since they've evolved into owning two electric vehicles, they've put up 2 kilowatt of solar panels. They have a geothermal setup for heating and cooling their house.
Right.
And the beauty has been, I've watched my mom and dad do these things, and my mom is always, engaging with folks and talking about what they're doing, and people follow,
Sure.
like I bet where they live out in rural Eastern Oregon that there's at least 20, EVs out there that are a result of their advocacy. So, it's clearly making a difference.
That's cool. They kinda set an example and people saw the practicality of it and they saw that it could work, which
Yeah,
is cool. I mean, when they had that first car there, it was kinda like a unicorn out there in the Baker Valley.
for sure.
You know,
For
nobody
sure.
probably was like, "What the heck's that thing? Is that somebody pedaling in that thing like Flintstones or what?"
Well, and the novelty of it, to that very point, people would come up to her in, like, grocery store parking lots and wanna see under the hood. You'd have these, like, big construction guys coming over and wanting to see what this little thing was. So, her actions clearly had an impact.
Sure.
And, on my side, I've spent a ton of time lobbying legislators. I probably reached out hundreds of times via calls, letters, and emails advocating for climate action. And so while we continue to debate, I think the reality is we're both right.
Mhm.
Individual actions make a positive impact, especially when they're visible and when you're making an attempt to talk about the success of those purchases.
Right.
I do think the other value is it helps us get smart on what solutions are out there to solve the
Sure.
climate crisis. So I think the caveat to all this, the but, is just that individual actions alone aren't going to be enough. They're going to help us make progress. They're going to, help drive demand for these like EV trucks that we're talking about. But on their own, given the time frame we have, they aren't going to be enough.
For sure.
I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think some of it goes back really to the first question that you asked me in the first episode of this podcast, and my answer to that question about why are you doing this? And my answer was I don't want people out there like me to feel like they're imposters, right? Because it's easy to feel like you're an imposter and everybody feels compromised. And some of this to me, like personal action, is about momentum, and it's a step by step process for people. And so they start at these personal things that they can do, but they start changing the way they purchase stuff. And I think it builds momentum and builds confidence. And I know you've talked to me about this, Jason, where people talk to you about I don't feel comfortable to call my congressman. I don't feel like I know enough. And I think when people do these things, they start to feel like they're part of a community and part of a larger picture, and they start to feel more confident to be able to affect change in advocacy. And so for me, that's my hope about personal action, is that it leads people to become part of a bigger community, find common ground, and do bigger things.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think it does build momentum and it creates some of that confidence that you need. Because for me, calling up member of Congress when I'm upset about something that's gone on or not gone on in terms of climate action, it's second nature. I mean, I have every one of my legislators' numbers programmed into my phone, and I just pick it up and I call and I leave a message. But that's a muscle that I had to build over time.
Sure.
It wasn't something that I had day one. And yeah, I think making climate smart purchases not only has an incremental impact and can influence others, but it creates that foundation. I think that's a great way of putting it.
Well, and another thing too, people should realize, if you got all the Congress people to share probably 75% of the messages that they receive, and you listen to those, you probably wouldn't feel unqualified to make a call. Uh,
It's very true.
there,
Very true.
well, it's probably a lot of angry people shouting, into a phone. So I wouldn't feel unqualified to make a call or write a letter to a congressperson.
No, that's a great point. And I think that's a nice segue into kind of the need for us to have advocacy to meet our climate targets. And so I think it's interesting to kind of look at it a little bit from a data side. So, if we look at the different sources of global emissions, the different categories, individual decisions control a subset of those, right? You have road and air transportation is roughly, 14% of global emissions, and making decisions about our transportation methods, et cetera, can affect that. Residential buildings, the homes we live in, 11%, of global emissions. And again, by shifting to renewables, making our homes more efficient, that can contribute to that. And then, the other category that we have some control over is the land use piece. Agriculture, forestry collectively account for about 18% of emissions.
Mm-hmm.
About 14% of those, 14% total rather, is meat. And so
Wow.
by eating lower on the food chain, again, we can move the dial there a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways that we as individuals today have some control, but that leaves about 60% of our emissions conservatively, because the reality is we can't reduce any of those categories to zero. So conservatively, we're talking about, over 60% of our emissions that are out of our control, things like heavy industry, things like, deforestation. So in that respect, it's going to take advocacy to move the dial on those things. And, I would argue to accelerate the transition, of transportation, residential buildings, et cetera, to carbon free. And so,
Mm-hmm.
it's helpful to look at, I think, some of the things that have been accomplished via advocacy. I mean, we have this renewable energy boom that's going on, across Europe, here in the United States, and that really, you got to credit the advocates that have pushed for things like tax incentives for renewables and research dollars for renewables,
Definitely.
and that, without a doubt, I mean, sure, there's been some technological improvements, but those are a result of there being calls for a different way to go in terms of energy. There's been a ton of great work around the world in terms of halting more fossil fuel infrastructure, very much advocacy driven.
Right.
We talk all the time about tax credits for EVs on this podcast, and that was absolutely driven by advocates saying, hey, to make this transition in the time we need to level the playing field. So there's a good opinion piece I read in The Guardian by Rebecca Solnit. Hopefully, I'm not butchering her name. She can reach out if I have. Um, she posed the question that I liked about this idea of, are we citizens or consumers? She talked about a
Mm.
consumer being someone who characterizes themselves by sort of what they buy, what they watch, consume, where she talked about a citizen as somebody who views themselves as part of, civil society, as actors in a political system, sort of what they do. And she made this nice kind of comparative where she said, hey, where she lives, she can ride in bike lanes because somebody advocated to get those bike lanes put in place, right?
Right.
She's able to purchase renewable power because somebody pushed, to have that utility create a renewables program. So I liked her lens on that. And, in my mind, it's like we should all find ways to be citizens, right?
Right. Definitely. That kind of reminds me of a Chomsky quote that I heard that always kind of stuck in my mind, basically talking about people's choices and about how markets restrict choices. And, he said, mass transportation is not a choice offered on the market. If you
Right.
if you want to go home today, the market does offer a choice between a Ford and a Toyota, but not between a car and a Subway, right?
Right.
And so it's very true that when you're a consumer, you only have a certain limited number of choices, but as a citizen, you kind of have that's where you can really create through advocacy, a higher level of choice.
Yeah, absolutely. So, given that we've been talking about carbon footprint here, we haven't talked necessarily much about kind of what the pieces of your carbon footprint are. Before we get into that, I just wanted to give some context on per capita greenhouse gas emissions. This data I'm drawing from here is as of 2016. You've got nations, at the top of the emissions chart like Canada, the US and Australia, all, around 15 tons per year or more.
Mm-hmm.
You go to our friends in Europe, and not surprisingly, they're doing a lot better. Germany's around 8.5 tons per year. The UK even better at around 5.5 tons. If we look at our neighbors in China, they're at about 7 tons, and then you go to countries like India, and it's only 1.75 tons
Wow.
per individual. So I think it's worthwhile just to have that context as we talk about carbon footprint, that there is a vast variation, and clearly, in my mind, a ton of opportunity for countries like US and Canada and Australia to shrink our per capita footprint.
Yeah, the disparity there between like the US at 15 and India at just less than 2 is pretty amazing, right?
It
Um
is.
and even the UK, the difference between the US and the UK is kind of striking. I was interested in this BBC article about the biggest pieces of reduction when we're talking about personal reductions in carbon footprint, and they have a chart here that has kind of your average reduction in tons of CO2 equivalent, and living car free was 2.04 tons, and owning a battery electric car was 1.95. So really, it really goes to show you how great, an electric car purchase is. It's almost the equivalent of just not having a car, uh, which I thought was pretty staggering, really.
Yeah.
And then the next one that jumped out to me, and we've talked about this before, is, one less long haul flight per year is 1.68 tons in reduction, which is like just a little bit less in some ways than driving an electric car for a whole year. Of course, we talked about carbon offsets, which can help with that too in one of our other episodes. Purchase of renewable energy was about 1.6 tons, which you can do that. Jason and I do that here in the Pacific Northwest. Obviously, it's going to be harder depending on, what's available to you, right? And that's where, advocacy comes in, create more available renewable energy.
This is a great graphic, and we'll definitely have it linked on our website. And I know it was developed probably with a European
Right.
audience in mind, so the numbers may not be quite the same, but it at least is a good gives you a good indication of what the big buckets are.
Right. And then of course as we've discovered here lately in some of our past episodes, just eating lower on the food chain is another big one. And this chart shows at zero point 0.8. So pretty big. And I think the cool thing about the personal choices here is that, if you're already going to be buying a car, the shift is not much to just look at buying electric. If you're already buying energy, which you are, and you have the ability to buy renewable, then it seems easy to make that choice. You're already going to eat food. So if you can just shift a little bit about what you're eating, it can make a huge impact. It's kind of like going on a diet. And it's like the successful ones are the ones where people kind of make changes, life changes about how they eat that are going to last the rest of their lives rather than trying to go on some kind of fad diet that they'll never be able to maintain. And that's the kind of way I look at these personal choices with climate is when you just kind of shift your life choices a little bit, you can make a long-term change and long-term impact.
For sure. I think that's a great way to put it. So as we, indicated, we'll have this graphic on our website. I think it's a great way to kind of visualize where there are opportunities to make a difference personally. And then for those who, haven't taken the time and are interested, we did a little bit of research on carbon calculators. They're, kind of a dime a dozen. But after trying, probably 6 or 7 different ones, the one that I think we'd like to recommend is the Cool Climate Calculator that was created by University of California, Berkeley. And, it accounts for all the goods and services in addition to things like transportation, you know, living and diet. You need to have like your average utility costs to plug in, but it's got a really clean interface and kicks out your results in comparison to, the average person. So it kind of gives you the where you're doing well and where there's opportunities for improvement. And we'll have the link to that as well, under the episode notes. Pivoting into opportunities for advocacy, just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of highlight some great organizations that are out there and encourage you to go and check them out and see, you know, test drive them a little bit, see which ones, maybe fit you best. There's an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, which I've actually done some volunteering for previously, so not entirely unbiased, but I love their tagline. It's our solution to climate change, democracy. They're an international organization, huge presence here in the US and Canada. They focus a lot of their work on really getting members educated on how to be advocates and giving them opportunities, to get engaged. And want to make sure I highlight, the fact that there's a carbon fee and dividend that we talked about previously that was passed in Canada not so long ago. And they were really instrumental, in getting that passed. And of course, we'd
Nice.
love our folks here in our US Congress to follow that example, but
Right.
we'll see. Another great organization is 350.org. It was founded by a group of, university friends and climate author Bill McKibben. Their focus is on, preventing new fossil fuel projects from going in, divesting from fossil fuels, and, what they call the transition to 100% renewable energy. They also have chapters all around the world, so you can, go on and figure out which chapter is closest to you, and then you have that opportunity for, for community. So they do a lot of great work as well.
We got to get Bill McKibben on this podcast.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to put out an invite there for Bill, and he can come on and talk about 350.org and, more of the details of how they affect change.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. The third one I wanted to highlight is an organization called the Climate Reality Project. And this was started by former Vice President Al Gore. And their focus, similar to Citizens Climate Lobby, is really, recruiting and training and mobilizing folks to be climate advocates. They don't necessarily line up behind a particular piece of legislation, but are focused on, getting aggressive climate action and high-level policies that not only accelerate a transition to clean energy, but a just transition.
Cool.
And they too have, international chapters.
We got to get Al Gore on this podcast.
Yeah, he'll be next.
All right. You line that up, Jason.
I'll work on it.
All right.
So some may be curious because we always end our podcast with Climate Optimist is brought to you by Climate Stewards Collective. And some may be wondering, well, what is that? So Climate Stewards is in its infancy, but it too is intended to be a project focused on advocacy. We're eventually hoping to be to a place where we can provide people who, are short on time and not sure kind of where to start on climate action, opportunities to make a difference through a network of lobbyists as well as individual opportunities to get engaged. And our focus really is going to be on bridging the urban-rural divide. We both grew up in, rural areas. We now live in urban areas. And I think there's a huge opportunity to bring both folks to the table in terms of finding climate solutions and ultimately getting a true coalition of folks to get those passed. So more to come on Climate Stewards.
So what you're saying is people should go to Climate Stewards Collective and donate something on the order of $500,000 a piece. And if you don't, then you're just basically saying you don't care about the future of our children.
Oh, folks are welcome to go visit the page. If you've been to our Climate Optimist podcast page, there's a link over to Climate Stewards that talks about what we're trying to accomplish. This all leads to the question, right? What can we do? I think we've given you plenty to do. But yeah, I continue to make climate-friendly purchases and decisions where you can, and talk about those purchases. And then, your other homework is to, find an organization that you like, if you're not already part of one, that provides, advocacy opportunities and a community of folks who are also, working to make a difference. Check out those organizations and see if there's one that resonates with you. So that's a wrap, I think. Thanks for tuning in. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways for each of us to make a difference. Climate Optimist is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. That's climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.